As I look out my hotel window, gazing at Goree Island, I wonder, did my ancestors come from here? Or from one of the other slave castles along the west coast of Africa? I'm on my way to Goree Island to just get a taste of what they went through when they were in these types of dungeons. Goree Island, these reminders with the cannons, the cannon turrets at the fort, of the battles between slavers, Portuguese, Dutch, trying to keep control of the slave trade. As I entered the harbor, it is a reminder of a time when ships would pull in to load the slaves. I go directly to visit my tour guide, Mary, and visit with her children here in Goree Island, since now people live on the island. The old side streets haunting memories of slavers walking up and down, moving around, hustling, grabbing slaves and taking them to the castle. The family sits gently in the sun, waiting for me to barter away maybe some lipstick, maybe some rouge, maybe some fingernail polish in exchange for some small item they may have. The other reminder is the church, the slavers' church. Even though they dealt in human flesh, they had a church to go to. And this dungeon, here off the coast of Senegal, Goree Island, to the left is where they kept the female slaves. And up top, in the middle, is where the governor of the island stayed. And from time to time, he would bring slave women up to have sex. I visit the most important place, the door of no return, because through this door, if my ancestors were there, they came through, and those who were sick or couldn't make it were thrown here into the waters to drown. A sad reminder of what my ancestors had to go through. I went in the dark room where it was supposed to be for slaves that acted up badly, recalcitrants, as they called them. And I knew that was probably where my ancestors were, because I knew they weren't leaving without a fight. Inside was just a dirt floor, no light at night, just total blackness, total darkness. And when the morning came, you could see that thin slit of light shining on the wall from outside. It was a horrible experience, and I felt bad for what they had to go through being in this dark place. It wasn't just Goree Island. There were other places like Cape Coast Island off the coast of Ghana. And I went there with the fishing boats, saw the castle, the gun turrets again reaching out over the ocean, trying to protect the slave trade. Here again, the dungeons. And when I was there, some other visitors, white visitors from Europe, came in, and the tour guide, who was African, wanted us all to go down together. And I told him we weren't going with them. They had to go on their own and experience it for themselves. They went down, and in a short period of time, all the women came out crying because they couldn't take it. And later we went down for our tour. And inside the walls, you could still feel the pain that they left there in the room. The spirit seemed to still be there. I tried to get them to allow me to spend the night in the dungeon, but they said it wasn't safe, and so I was not allowed to do that. You see here the trapdoor that was used to bring female slaves up. And in this case, I was told that if a slave woman had a child by the slave owner, then that child could go free into the population and not be a slave. So I would expect that there were numerous women who came here, had children, in hopes that their children might really be free. The crew that was with me, Carol, Yusuf, all the rest, we decided to pour a libation to our ancestors who may have been there. And as I called out the names of my ancestors, it overwhelmed me, and I began to cry. Just remembering their names and remembering that their ancestors may have come through this place. The slaves would have left here, 80% of them going to Brazil, another small portion going to Hispaniola, and a smaller portion coming on to the United States. Many were branded, some with the letter A representing the Anglican Church as they set out on their voyage. Many of them stuck like sardines in a ship, occasionally coming up top to get fresh air and to breathe a little. And on some occasion, deciding that they were not going to go this full journey, that instead of being a slave in this European slavery system, they would rather die. So they took their children and went overboard. I don't know where they came in, don't know what port they landed in. All I know is that they came as prisoners of war into a slavery system that landed, to my knowledge, my oldest ancestors, onto the plantation of one of the sons of Abram Harshaw, who was in fact the biggest slave owner in North Carolina. On his plantation in Murphy, North Carolina, Cherokee County, where he acquired 100 acres of land for just $100 after they removed the Cherokees from the land in 1838. His family went on to enjoy the legacy of that wealth and move on with their lives. I took my family, my aunt Georgiana, my uncle James, my cousin Aunt Fanny Hitchcock Bowman, down to the plantation with me along with some other relatives. When we got there and Aunt Fanny saw the land that was on this plantation, she cried because she could not believe that our ancestors worked all of this land day in and day out. After they removed the Cherokees and the claim for land came in, two families, the Harshaws and the Fains, claimed the land. Most people rode over a small piece of land or a nice piece of land and claimed it. The Harshaws and the Fains took each side of the river and rode for 24 hours, claiming all the land that they rode over. The plantation still being there in Murphy, North Carolina, Cherokee County, still a spacious place, and it is a place that if you go, would bring up a lot of memories, a lot of things that would make you think about what our ancestors went through. When we got there, my Aunt Georgiana said she had been here before. And I asked her what was the occasion, and she said as a small child, she used to come to this house, and that there's a well in the back of the house, which there is. She said there was a white woman that used to come to the steps, bring her sandwiches, her and my Uncle James, my dad, and say, "I'm your grandmother." The irony is she was not in fact white, she was mulatto, and it was her grandmother, my great-great-grandmother, Mary Suddeth, who worked in the plantation house. We walked around to the Harshaw Cemetery, and with all the tombstones of those who had been buried inside those walls, and the irony of seeing your own name on tombstones in a cemetery is kind of eerie. But we ventured on after a while and found the slave cemetery. And the only thing on that the only two headstones remaining in that slave cemetery was one of my great-great-grandmother, Mary Suddeth, and one of Charles Harshaw. The others were merely stones in the ground, rocks indicating a grave, and we estimated there were at least over 100 graves back in that slave cemetery. I was fortunate enough to collect a slave list from the will of John Harshaw, who lived there in Cherokee County and was one of the grandsons of Abram Harshaw. In his will, he also manumits or frees one of his slaves, and her name was Mary. I continue to believe that this was my great-great-grandmother, Mary Ann Harshaw, who was married to Harry Harshaw. He was born in 1797. She was born in 1810. There is an irony on this slave list in that near the bottom is one Indiana Harshaw, who married my mother's father. She was the first wife of my grandmother, Wayne Courtney's father, Monroe Courtney. So my grandmother and their first child, Henrietta, were in fact stepsisters. My aunt, Naomi Marietta, is in fact named after Etta. In my great-great-grandmother's affidavit to get the pension of her son, David Harshaw, who fought in the Civil War, she lists her children: Harriet, Clem, George H. George H. and Clem were twins, so that left 4 children. It also states that she and her husband Harry were married in 1846, and who they were married by. They were married by Richard Harshaw, and it lists him as colored. I wish that it had said his father Richard, his cousin Richard, his brother Richard, so that I would have some connection to another Harshaw family. Harriet died at 12, Clem died at 13, and David died in the hospital after he became ill, serving in the Civil War at the age of 19. So that only left my great-great-grandfather, George H., to be the leading ancestor that would bring forth children from the direct line of this family. David is buried in the National Cemetery in Nashville, Tennessee, along with the other Harshaws that served in the Civil War, most of them serving in 15th Regiment, Company G, United States colored troops. This is a picture of the hospital as it actually was in 1861 when he died. As you can see, it is no wonder that he passed. Harry died in 1856. He's buried in Hayesville Cemetery in Hayesville, North Carolina, not far from Murphy. In filling out the pension application, my great-great-grandmother, Mary Ann, had to get witnesses to vouch for her character and to say what she was saying was true, and that she had no other means of support other than the things she was doing. It breaks my heart each time I read what one of her neighbors said about her. She basically said, "I see her walking down the road, veins broken in her legs, taking in washing, trying to survive after slavery." My great-great-grandfather, George H., moved across the border into Georgia to the small town and old Cherokee village of Ellijay, Georgia. There he met and married Georgiana Withrow. She was the daughter of Dempsey Withrow, who had come to Ellijay from North Carolina to start his life as a free, enterprising farmer. When the 14th Amendment was passed in 1868 that allowed men to vote, both my great-great-great-grandfather, Dempsey Withrow, and my great-great-grandfather, George H. Harshaw, voted 2 years later in 1870. George H. Harshaw and Georgiana Withrow had 8 children, the first being Jane, then came Maggie, then came John Henry, then came 2 sets of twins, George H. being a twin himself, Josephine and Dempsey, twins, Belle and George Charles, twins. And finally, my grandfather who raised me, James Walter Harshaw. Dempsey didn't like taking pictures, so there are no pictures of him. Josephine, his twin, had no pictures taken. Uncle Charles was the same. He did not like pictures, so there are no pictures of him. There is, in fact, this picture of his twin sister on Belle. My great-great-grandfather, George H., died at a very young age of 36 in 1891, and he is buried in a white family's cemetery, the Fell Cemetery in Ellijay, Georgia. When I went to discover that grave, I got a call from a gentleman in Copper Hill, North Carolina, who had read an article that was in the newspaper printed from Murphy, North Carolina, about our family history. He informed me that there was a tombstone of a Harshaw in his family cemetery. And so I went with him to LJ and discovered, in fact, it was my great-great-grandfather's grave. The irony is, when we were children, traveling from Cincinnati to Murphy and on to Atlanta on the train, when we got to Copper Hill, the home of the gentleman that called me, all the blacks had to get on the floor of the train because whites would either shoot through the window or try and jump on the train and pull you off. And they almost got my Uncle Walter Mills, except that my father grabbed his arm, pulled him back on the train, and saved him. So there is a big irony in that story. When George died, my grandfather James was only 3 years old. My great-great-grandmother Georgiana remarried, married Lafayette Jackson, who was at least 8 years younger than she was, so she must have been a bad lady to walk around with children in the South and still pick up a young man. Go, Grandma. When my grandfather James was 12, and yes, I said 12, he started working for the railroad in LJ, Georgia as a water boy. He finished his career in 1954 after 54 years of working on the railroad. My great-great-grandmother Georgiana died at the age of 98, and she is in fact buried in LJ, Georgia.